So, I've been playing the surprisingly good new Indiana Jones game, and it got me thinking. Ancient civilizations are really cool, so I'm going to talk about them. Today we're going to be discussing world-building ancient civilizations, from their lasting impact on society to exploring them in the modern world. This video should be useful to you whether you're writing a novel, making a tabletop RPG campaign, or just world building in general. So, ancient civilizations are one of those broad-reaching topics that can be used in a brilliantly varied set of ways. They can be used for horror, for adventure, fantasy, sci-fi. Really, just about any genre you can come up with can benefit from some type of ancient civilization. And that's simply because the very concept of them is something that almost anybody will find interesting. How did the people of the past live, and how did they answer life's questions? So we're going to break this video into 4 stages. The types of ancient civilization, its level of advancement, its disappearance or fall, and its discovery in the modern day of your setting. And for this topic, we're going to start with part 1, historical, mythical, fantastical. So here we're going to discuss the reality of your ancient civilization within your world. Even within fantasy worlds, ancient civilizations may be fantasies within them. Naturally, your first type is going to be a historical ancient civilization. Now, when I say that, I obviously don't mean our Earth historical, but historical in the sense that it literally existed and is known about within your world. Though you can and probably should draw from real-life Earth ancient civilizations to give you something to work with. This is also the most downriver of the categories, so to speak, as a fantastical civilization may have a little more discovered and become mythical, and then have more discovered and become historical, but it doesn't really go the other way around, except with the passage of time and the loss of information. Anyway, a historical ancient civilization is going to have that classification because it exists firm within the minds of those who came after it. A good example is essentially every ancient civilization that you think of when you hear that term. Ancient Rome, China, Egypt, Greece, all of them are this sort. Because we know them to have existed, we have gathered artifacts from them, explored their ruins, and otherwise read accounts of their actions. However, if you go further back in time, you find this odd middle ground where people knew a lot less about them. Obviously less than those who lived in them, but also less than us in the modern day who have modern tools to learn things about them and discover the places they used to live. So in your world, it'll be worth figuring out exactly how much information people do have about your ancient civilization. The next categorization here is mythical ancient civilizations. This is a level up from historical in the sense that there is actual material evidence that this civilization existed, but it's sort of tied up in myth and religion and other less concrete things. These ones are going to tend to have a lot less and even conflicting information about them. These can be a lot of fun to make though, because you have a huge capacity for mysteries. These are often where you might find your dangerous ruins with traps and a magical treasure laying at its end. A good example of this would be the Zonai from The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, because they actually sort of started in the fantastical or mythical category before Link and Zelda discover more and more things about them, and then they move categories to where by the end of the game you'd probably class them as historical. This is best exemplified by their almost complete absence from the previous game, Breath of the Wild, where they're only mentioned like every now and again, I think in like an armor set or something. But as far as how they were highly advanced, and they ruled as a part of the Kingdom of Hyrule in its very earliest of days. You also uncover their secrets at about the time that you uncover their toys, essentially, that you get to mess around with in the game. So it strikes a really nice balance between progression of lore and story, and then progression of game mechanics. Who'd have thought? Tears of the Kingdom is a pretty good game. Finally, we've got fantastical ancient civilizations. These are the sorts that you can have like crazy tinfoil conspiracies about, but these are also the sorts that may be so ancient, so unknown about, that they would have been considered mythical even by people who came 1,000 years before. With these, you can get really wild with the sorts of things you do with them because there's not as much of a burden of anything about them being real, and it actually gives you 2 really interesting paths to take. Either 1, some of the crazy stuff is real and it's like this mind-blowing moment, or 2, it gives you the opportunity to discover what the real truth about them was, which will often be a little more grounded or maybe completely different from what anybody expected. These, alongside the mythical ones, are also really fun for that whole crazy trope of the government's behind it, they are hiding it from us. Or some power that be knows that this ancient civilization was historical and did exist, but for some reason or another, they don't want the general public to know that, so they hide it, and you have this whole conspiracy thing. But they might do this because whatever the truth is could challenge some sort of societal or religious or even a scientific conception held by most people. Slight spoiler ahead for Indiana Jones and the Great Circle's first hour, give or take. The game is in part about the mythical Nephilim, which is the mythical order of giants said to have existed both before and after the Great Flood of the Old Testament. The Nephilim are pretty much the go-to real-life example of a fantastical ancient civilization. They are talked about in the Old Testament, but nobody's actually sure what they were supposed to be. Some people think they were 18-foot tall like superhumans, and then other people think that it was probably just a term they used to describe strong warriors. Because we know so little about them, they've become this really interesting little thing where there's all these just crazy crackpot theories about what they may or may not have been. So even if you put absolutely no stock into the idea that they existed, you've still got to admit it's kind of interesting to think about. That brings us to part 2. How advanced were they? This is always a really fun question to ask with ancient civilizations because we often find out in archaeology that any given ancient civilization was way ahead of its time in some specific topic. I think the archetypical example here would be the ancient Romans and their aqueducts and plumbing. People by the 1500s still had basically no plumbing, so the fact the Romans did it literally a millennium and a half before is just mind-boggling to think about. Either way, as far as levels of advancement go for your civilization, the first one is the to-be-expected one. That is to say, the civilization is about as advanced as the time period in which they lived might suggest. Might be Stone Age, though there aren't really a whole lot of Stone Age civilizations, but probably, Bronze Age, Iron Age, that sort of thing. There's not a whole lot else to say here, though. But of course, if you are bothering to create them, there probably is something about them that is rather unconventional. Perhaps they possess ancient artifacts with magical power. Maybe they existed in a time when divine beings roamed the earth. Or maybe they just exist in a place that it seems like nobody should have been able to live in. The second level is the advanced for their time, which is as far of a level as we've ever seen in real life. Once again, Rome is the example here, but there are also others like the Indus River Valley civilization in India. These, of course, are ones that weren't fantastically beyond their peers around them at the time, but they were advanced in certain ways that are notable for just how different it would have been from everything else of its time. I love the Roman example because while you could say that their war tactics were more advanced, which they were, or their metalworking was better than those who surrounded them, which it was, or their governmental structure was more stable than most of their peers, which it also was, but I really like the idea of the aqueducts and the plumbing, and it's just because that's something that we take completely for granted nowadays. Imagine how inconvenient and frankly gross life is if you don't have running water. So I might recommend throwing in those kinds of details if you're working at an ancient civilization that's at this level. Think about the civic things, the things that impact people's daily lives. Those are often the ones that'll get your audience to think about them more, as that would be nice. The third and final level is the beyond the modern level, which is to say that the civilization is not only more advanced than its peers, but more advanced than the people who discover them. This is where those Zonai from Tears of the Kingdom come right back in, and also where a number of others that you might be familiar with also are involved, like the Dwemer from the Elder Scrolls, or the old ones of Warhammer Fantasy or 40k, and many, many more. It's a really interesting way to do things because it allows you to just crack the lid on certain things that you wouldn't want to have be widespread in your world. For a very stupid example, let's say our good old friend protagonist Von Generic is exploring an ancient cairn deep in the mountains. He ventures through this ancient dungeon, fighting these strange constructs, and then at the very bottom he opens a chest, and within he pulls out a Colt 1911 45 ACP, God's caliber. All of a sudden, protagonist Von Generic is the most dangerous guy around. At least if he can aim, which he probably can't. But if he could, ogre, bang. Troll, bang. Dragon, bang. Tax collector, Bang! This is useful in the sense that while protagonists may now have a gat, that doesn't mean you've actually introduced firearms into your universe wholesale. There's only one example of the firearm, and even if it was taken apart and studied by metal workers of that area, that doesn't mean they'd actually be able to make it. They don't have the industrial machining needed to produce all of the parts. They don't know how to formulate the different types of gunpowder that would be used, and all those other sorts of processes that they don't have. It's like getting something at the 10th level of a tech tree when you just started at the first. Now, obviously, don't jump the shark with these sorts of things, but you can pull off little things like that as long as you're wise about it. But that does bring us to part 3, how they fell. In order for a civilization to be ancient and not just a civilization, something has to have happened to it at some point. The lame but often true explanation is that a good deal of them are just sort of assimilated into their neighbors eventually, in a way that isn't ultimately all that dramatic. But of course, there are plenty of other ways to see it done. The first is the most classic, which is the unsolvable mystery. Maybe you don't need an explanation to what happened. Now, of course, audiences nowadays really like to have every single question answered, which is understandable, but you don't have to do it every time. This can especially work if the ancient civilization and its mystery isn't a core component of your story, but if it's more so just the source of some item or concept or conflict you need to have happen. In those cases, you may not actually need to explain the disappearance. The Dwemer in the Elder Scrolls are a good example of this because it's never concretely stated what exactly got rid of them. There is a legend about the Second Battle of Red Mountain, where some sort of spell backfired and in the aftermath all of the Dwemer just sort of disappeared. However, that's very abrupt, and the general idea of "and then they were all gone suddenly" doesn't quite seem like that's all there would have been. So for that reason, it's remained something of a mystery since. The second type of disappearance is getting conquered. This one is rather dramatic, rather fun, and rather common. It happened to Rome. Who else could I mention first? They were surrounded by the Goths, and after a series of brutal losses throughout their empire, the city of Rome fell in the 5th century. Though you could argue that Rome in a sense lasted until the Byzantines, they too fell in the 15th century to the Ottomans. Both of them were conquered by an invading force. This has also happened to several different Chinese dynasties, as well as the Aztecs and the Inca. It's common, often tragic, and almost always an interesting story. However, due to how common it is, it's probably worth shaking up your variant of it a little bit. Play into the drama a little bit, make it really mean something, make it feel like something. My favorite way to do this would be discovering written perspectives from the people from the falling civilization so you can see how they felt about watching their whole world collapse around them. Those sorts of things may help the characters, and thus the audience, relate or sympathize with the almost forgotten people of the past. The third type of disappearance would be the plague. As we all know, large-scale diseases can wreak quite a lot of havoc on society, but especially in a pre-modern civilization, that sort of thing is going to be a really big deal, really bad, really quick. Plagues can and have been the difference maker between a civilization thriving for hundreds more years and falling completely apart. Heck, a large amount of European history was determined by the economic changes that needed to happen following the bubonic plague because so many people were gone that they needed to figure out a different way to organize the labor. And you can really play up the apocalyptic nature of how this would have felt. If it's a pre-modern civilization, they don't understand where the disease comes from. They don't know why it happened. They don't know how to stop it, how to cure it. They don't know anything. It is as if the hand of God is just plucking people out of the earth and, you've got bumps on your skin and a cough. Whoops, you're gone. You can also have magic affect this, but of course, if it's a plague wiping them out, the magic won't be enough in some way. Maybe it's not powerful enough. Maybe it's not accessible to enough people. Maybe they don't find the right spell until too late. At a large enough scale, you'll be seeing the breakdown of society, the burning of cities, and essentially, as said, an apocalypse. Ruins might be found in disarray or empty entirely due to the desperation of these kinds of situations. You can also play into the idea that whatever disease wiped them out might one day return, which can be a fun source of tension if you want to do that. And that might be most relevant when combined with our last form of disappearance, the curse. This is a pretty broad category, and as one might expect, it's largely going to apply to the mythical and fantastical types, though obviously depending on your world, it can very well be a historical one as well. But if you want an easy example, you're likely familiar with pretty much every single culture has a flood myth. Now, it's not the case in all of them, but in a great deal of them, this flood that wipes out most of humanity is said to be some sort of punishment for the sin of man. Of course, these kinds are on a rather global scale and can be even useful as a part of a founding myth for a world, but they can of course be scaled down to fit with a single civilization. The standard way is that the curse will come from some sort of influential figure within the civilization making a mistake or giving in to some flaw of theirs. Maybe they're tampering with powers they more or less shouldn't be, and they doom their people. My own world fits by far the most into this category. My ancient civilization was one in which all of the humans were immortal, and the way that the curse happened wasn't even really their fault. One of their deities, the only one yet to provide something to humanity, was seduced by a force known as the Cataclysm, who convinced that deity to give them the gift of death, because they'd all grown sort of complacent and lethargic, given that if you live forever, it's not like you need to do anything tomorrow, do you? So in a society where the average age was probably something like 500, everybody above the age of 90 died instantaneously, with many others following soon after. Given that that was probably like 90% of the population, it would be underselling it to say that the civilization collapsed. Imagine having no concept of the idea that if you fall, you can break a bone. So because of that, their language is untranslatable in the current day, their ruins are poorly understood, and ultimately very little is known about them other than the little bits and pieces of stuff that's left behind. This sort of setup is probably my favorite if you're working within a fantasy world, as it means setting up a key sin, mistake, conflict, something like that helps define your setting in its present. With that, we can move to part 4, Discovery. Discovery, finally, is the thing that your characters will actually be doing. Given that all of these could be more or less explained by, and so they entered the temple, this section will be a little more about the process itself, why they might be there, what they might find. The first ruins exploration archetype is what I'll call the Indiana Jones. In these cases, your characters pretty much know what they're looking for and are seeking it out. As a very obvious example, in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Indy is racing against a rich millionaire sponsored by the Nazis to discover the Holy Grail first, with his dad tagging along because his life's work has been trying to discover that Grail. For this kind of structure, that conflict is what the civilization is for. It's the fuel for it. The Indiana Jones way of handling these situations is generally that Indiana Jones does not kill the bad guys himself. He probably punches some Nazis, shoots a couple Nazis, whatever, but he doesn't kill the bad guy. Instead, he solves the mystery, or he understands the meaning of the artifact he's seeking. Do not look at the Ark. Do not use the power of Shiva for evil. Do not drink from the cup of Christ seeking your own eternal life. Remember that Christ lived a humble life and probably wouldn't have a golden goblet, and the antagonist does not solve this mystery, leading to their downfall. They're killed by their hubris or their greed, as opposed to being shot or blown up or something. Another way of handling it is the Call of Cthulhu. This will generally be applying to anything in which horror is the goal of your ancient civilization. Here the rewards are straight up not worth it, and in the Indiana Jones it'll be your antagonists suffering the consequences. In the Call of Cthulhu sense, it's probably going to be your protagonists suffering the consequences, because they're meddling in powers that they shouldn't be. Obviously, cosmic horror, which I do have a video on, is a great thing to combine with ancient civilizations, as often the sources of that cosmic horror are impossibly ancient, and so there will often have been ancient peoples who worship them in some form or another. It'll often be obvious that continuing ahead is kind of a bad idea, so make sure you spend some time explaining why your protagonists see the Cthulhu-shaped danger and press ahead. Is it pride? Is it greed? Is it a desperate curiosity to know what lies beyond the veil? And what price are they willing to pay to satisfy those feelings? And of course, I can't not mention the Dungeons & Dragons way of looking at these. It even says in the 5e Dungeon Master's Guide, as one of the core assumptions of the game, that the world is ancient. Ancient civilizations and their knowledge survive in legends, magic items, and their ruins. Chaos and evil often follow an empire's collapse. Dungeons & Dragons has dungeons in the name for a pretty good reason. And often it's not in the sense of some, lord's dungeon, but in the ancient ruin, the unexplored place. At its core, D&D is all about exploring these places, fighting monsters, and getting treasure. Depending on how you run your campaigns, the civilization may not even be important except as a source of loot, but I've found keeping it coherent when I run my games is a lot of fun. If your players run into multiple temples or ruins from the same civilization, they may start to notice common themes. You might recognize types of traps, types of puzzles, and kind of get an idea of what to expect. Of course, there are tons of other ways to have your characters interact with ancient civilizations. Maybe they're unearthed by accident. Perhaps some curse the civilization cast upon the world ages ago comes to fruition. Maybe survivors of that civilization are discovered somewhere. Ancient civilizations are so fun because of how many things you can do with them. Anyway, with that, I think we've covered ancient civilizations and how you might utilize them. If you're working on any of your own ancient civilizations, tell me about them in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed, and since we're still small here at JBat, every single like and subscription goes a pretty long way. Anyway, if you want to hang out with my editor and I, we have a Discord, and if for some reason you're crazy enough to want it, we have a Patreon and channel memberships, all of this being linked in the description below. With that, actually, I have to shout out our very first patron, Shadowrunner, who signed up as a Knight of the Inner Circle at the $10 level, which I just have to give you a special shout out for because that's crazy. That's super generous. Thank you, man. Anyway, thank you for watching. And remember, make sure to weigh the sandbag correctly if you're about to swipe a golden idol.